deep and inky blacks, no blooming, near instant response time. That's what we'll usually say when talking about OLEDs. But there's more than just that, and not all OLEDs are the same. Hey, I'm Nicholas from Ratings.com. Today we're comparing the Gigabyte AORUS FO27Q3 and the ASUS ROG Strix XG27AQDMG. They're both 27-inch OLED gaming monitors with a 1440p resolution, but they don't have the same type of OLED panel. The Gigabyte is a QD-OLED with a 360Hz refresh rate, while the ASUS is a WOLED with a 240Hz refresh rate. So what does this all mean for any differences between them? And which monitor should you get? Since we want to focus on the differences in picture quality and performance, let's jump right into that. Before turning the monitors on, you'll notice one difference, especially if you're using them in a bright room. Light is spread out a bit more on the ASUS. Reflections aren't as strong on the Gigabyte, even though they both have glossy coatings. But that's not the biggest difference. In a bright room, blacks look purple on the Gigabyte. This is because light facing the screen causes the black levels to rise on QD-OLEDs like this one. Even though the black levels don't remain perfect on the ASUS in bright rooms either, they just don't look purple. While we have the lights on, let's talk about the SDR Brightness. The ASUS is actually one of the brightest OLEDs we've tested so far thanks to its MLA Plus layer, making it a good choice to use in most bright rooms. The ASUS gets the brightest if you turn the uniform brightness setting off. Doing this causes some changes in brightness across different content, but it isn't bad enough to be distracting. Turning it on makes the screen a lot dimmer though. The Gigabyte has a similar setting called APL Stabilize, but it's a bit different in how it impacts the brightness. The screen gets the brightest if you have it on high, but then the changes in brightness are too distracting, like if you're opening and closing windows. Plus, even with it on high, most content still doesn't get as bright as on the ASUS. Instead, there's more consistent brightness between different content if you set it to low, but the trade-off is that the screen gets dimmer. This is a lot to say that if you want to use your monitor in a bright room, then the ASUS takes the cake. But like with most monitors, you won't really be able to see either screen properly if you place them opposite a sunny window. But if you want to use them in a dark room, they're a lot more even in performance. Like any OLED, they have a perfect contrast ratio with deep blacks. The bigger difference comes with their colors though, especially in HDR. The Gigabyte displays a wider range of colors that are more accurate. But you know, the biggest advantage for the Gigabyte has to do with the color volume. Bright colors are a lot more vivid, so images look more realistic. You could really notice this in content with bright colors, like atmospheric or sports games. Colors look more accurate on the Gigabyte too, even in SDR. They each don't have perfect accuracy, and there are some issues. But the ASUS just has a few more problems, like with the white balance and color accuracy. Of course, this point is invalid if you calibrate them to your liking. Before getting into gaming, let's talk about one more thing regarding the picture quality, and that's the text clarity. They both have typical issues that OLEDs have with rendering text, like color fringing, but these look worse on the ASUS, especially with clear type enabled. The ASUS does have a pixel edge setting that's supposed to reduce fringing, but it really doesn't help much and actually makes text look worse. So we know there are some differences with the picture quality, and it's the same with gaming. Like we mentioned at the start of the video, the Gigabyte has a higher 360Hz refresh rate compared to 240Hz on the ASUS. This is useful if you have a setup that can maintain such high frame rates. Plus, the Gigabyte has HDMI 2.1 bandwidth, so you could reach the max refresh rate over HDMI. This is also useful for console gaming, as the Gigabyte supports any signal from the PS5 and Xbox Series X or S. Even though the ASUS still supports 1440p signals up to 120Hz on either console, the Gigabyte can downscale 4K signals instead, even at 120Hz. The main advantage of doing this is because the Xbox only supports HDR with 4K signals. So at least you could play games at 120Hz in HDR on the Gigabyte. Besides the refresh rate, the actual performance of the two is very similar when gaming. Even the input lag is similar, and you can't really feel any differences here. They both have a near instant response time for sharp motion, but of course, the Gigabyte feels smoother when gaming at its max refresh rate. The ASUS does have a backlight strobing feature to try to reduce persistence blur, but it's pretty limited in how you can use it. It only works with fixed 120Hz signals, and it makes the screen dim. But hey, at least it reduces blur well. One last thing that's the same when it comes to gaming is that they both have VRR flicker. This happens with pretty much any OLED, and you can see this in dark scenes when the frame rate changes a lot. It's distracting on each, but the ASUS has a setting to reduce the flicker called OLED anti-flicker. It definitely helps, but it isn't perfect because it causes stutter, and it works by changing the min and max refresh rates of the monitor. So with all that said, which monitor should you get? There's no question that the Gigabyte is the better monitor here. The higher refresh rate is useful for most gamers, and the better picture quality is also a plus. And it even has some extra features that the ASUS doesn't have, like a USB-C port, KVM switch, and HDMI 2.1 bandwidth, so you can connect all kinds of different devices. But this doesn't mean that the Gigabyte is the better choice for everyone. There are some benefits to getting the ASUS, with the main one being that more setups can reach the max 240Hz refresh rate. Another thing to consider is if your gaming room is bright, and that's where the ASUS also has an advantage. And of course, price is another factor, because the ASUS usually costs less. Like comparing Jordan and LeBron, these are two of the best on the court, and choosing one over the other really comes down to what you need. And the same could be said if you're comparing any of the 27-inch QD and W OLEDs that have come out this year. That's all for the comparison between the ASUS ROG Strix XG27AQDMG and the Gigabyte AORUS FO27Q3. If you want more details on the monitors, check out our written reviews. The links are in the description below. Until next time, I'm Nicholas from Ratings.com, where we help you find the best products for your needs. Ciao. That's all for the comparison between the ASUS ROG Strix XG27AQDMG and the Gigabyte AORUS FO20.
Oh no, it's okay.
Yeah, of course it's the monitor names. Okay, let's try that again. Okay.